Hi there. This video is about the cardiac cycle. Now, as you might gather from the word cycle, the cardiac cycle is one complete cycle or revolution or heartbeat from wherever we start to back to that point again. Now, the cardiac cycle is putting together all of the things that you've been learning in this topic. It's looking at the anatomy, it's looking at the blood flow, it's looking at the electrical events, depolarization, repolarization. It's looking at contraction and relaxation. It's looking at valves opening and closing, and looking at flow. And did I say pressure? Also pressure. And heart sounds, lots of things. Okay, so the cardiac cycle has 4 phases. The first phase is actually represented in this diagram by 2 different colors. The first phase is called ventricular filling. So in this, the ventricles are filling with blood. It's further broken down into 3 subphases: rapid filling, diastasis, and atrial systole, which we're going to look at in just a moment. The next phase, which we see here, is isovolumetric contraction. Iso means same, volume, metric means to measure, and we know that the ventricles are contracting. So what this tells us is that during this phase, the ventricles are contracting, but there is the same volume of blood in the ventricles. In other words, they're squeezing, but they can't get anything out yet. Then we move into the next phase, which is ventricular ejection. And here the ventricles are still contracting, but they have finally generated enough pressure to open the valves to let the blood exit the ventricles. So this is, both of these are happening during ventricular contraction. After the ventricles finish contracting and begin relaxing, we go into the last phase of the cardiac cycle, which is isovolumetric relaxation. So here, the ventricle's relaxing, but the volume of blood in the ventricles is not changing. In other words, it hasn't gotten low enough to be filled again yet. When the pressure in the ventricles is low enough, then we're going to move back into ventricular filling. Okay, so to understand all the events that are going on in the cardiac cycle and to line them up so we understand when they are happening, we're going to look at a number of different graphs. At the very top here, you can see that I've labeled when the ventricle is contracting and when it's relaxing. So this is ventricular diastole, the ventricles are relaxing. This is ventricular systole, the ventricles are contracting. The first graph we're going to look at is the EKG, which, as you know, measures the depolarization and repolarization of the muscle cells in the heart. And it's got the P wave, which is where the atria are depolarizing, the QRS complex, where the ventricles are depolarizing and the atria are repolarizing. And then we have the T wave, which is where the ventricles are repolarizing. We're also going to look at how this connects with ventricular pressure. Now, in this graph, I've got the pressure in the great arteries, this line right here, the pressure in the atria, this line right here, and the pressure in the ventricles, which is fluctuating way more than the pressure in the other 2 spots. So whenever the pressure in the ventricles is higher than the pressure in the great arteries, blood's going to move from the ventricle to the great arteries, which means we're in ventricular ejection. Whenever the pressure in the ventricles is lower than the pressure in the atria, the blood is going to flow from the atria to the ventricles, and that means we're in ventricular filling. Anytime that we are in between, there are no open valves and therefore no flow of blood. So these are going to be our isovolumetric phases here. We're also going to look at ventricular blood volume, or the volume of blood in the ventricles. Now, here you can see that the ventricle is at its emptiest point. And just like you would watch the water level in a glass go up as you fill it, as we see this line go up, that means that the ventricles are filling with blood. And when we see the line go down, the ventricles are being emptied. So here, no change, isovolumetric. Here, an increase in volume, a large increase in volume, small increase in volume, and medium increase in volume. No change, and then ventricular ejection or a decrease in volume. We're going to put that together with heart sounds. So heart sounds come from valve closures. Not the sound of the valve actually closing, but what we hear is the sound of the blood crashing against the closed valve. And you can see that there's a heart sound here and a heart sound here. These correspond to what you would hear with a stethoscope. So lub-dup, lub-dup. This is lub-dup, the first heart sound and the second heart sound. Okay, let's start going through it phase by phase. We're going to start with ventricular filling, which has the three subphases. Now, if we look at this, there's not much going on in the EKG until we get to the third one, the P wave. There's really no change in ventricular pressure. The ventricular pressure stays lower than the pressure in the atria. We can see that the blood volume is increasing and there's no heart sounds. So I'm going to focus on just the ventricular filling part. And we're going to talk about what's happening with pressure here. So take a look at this, where the ventricular pressure has just become lower than the pressure in the atria. So this is what accounts for the sudden, rapid increase in blood volume in the ventricles. Okay, so here is that graph again. Here is what's called rapid filling. So you can see this sudden increase. This also goes by the name of cardiac suction. And the reason is that if you were actually in the atrium or the ventricle and watching this happen, the moment that the AV valve opens, there is a powerful suction from the ventricle pulling the blood in the atria inside. It would be sort of like watching a toilet flush. So it's rather dramatic, and we see the biggest increase in volume here. So this is rapid filling. This next part is called diastasis. Dia means through or across. Stasis means steady. So this is like a steady flow. And what's happening here is that the blood is returning from the body, kind of dripping into the atrium, and then just going straight through to the ventricle. Nothing's really pushing it. Nothing very exciting is happening. It's just a steady drip, drip, drip into the ventricle. And it doesn't add a lot of blood. Now, this last part of ventricular filling is called atrial systole. And you can see that we have another rather large increase in volume. Not as big as what we saw in rapid filling, but still kind of a bump. This is because the atria are actually contracting, and that's forcing additional blood into the ventricles. Now, I forgot. Once again, here we go. Rapid filling, diastasis, and atrial systole. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen images of the workers on the Japanese subway at rush hour, but there are people whose job it is to push additional people into the train before it takes off. This increases the efficiency of transit because the trains are carrying more people with each trip. So we can think of it this way. The train, which is like the ventricles, stops in the station. The doors open, people get out, but that part's not analogous. But then the people that are waiting on the platform, that have been waiting on the platform, get in. So there's a sudden rush of people, the rapid filling into the train. The train's still sitting there with the doors open. As people arrive at the platform, they just kind of go straight into the train. Just adds a few people. And then atrial systole is like these workers pushing the last few people that can fit into the train or the ventricle. And just like it increases efficiency on the Japanese subway, it also increases efficiency in our cardiac cycle. Okay, so that was ventricular filling. Let's move on to the next phase. So in ventricular filling, we could see what was in atrial systole, we could see that the P wave indicated that the atria were depolarizing and contracting, and that corresponds with this last increase in volume. And towards the end of that, we see the beginnings of the QRS complex, which means that the ventricles are depolarizing. And of course, whenever the ventricles depolarize, they're going to contract. So we see depolarization starting here, and shortly after, we see the pressure in the ventricles start to increase. Now, at the moment that the ventricular pressure becomes higher than the pressure in the atria, the blood wants to go from the ventricles back to the atria. It's like, whoa, it's getting crowded in here. Let me go back to where there was a little more room. But the AV valves close, which prevents the backflow of blood. And if we go down here to heart sounds, we can see this first heart sound. So that is the AV valves closing. Now, ventricular pressure continues to increase, but it is still lower than the pressure in the great arteries, which means that it cannot force the semilunar valves open and eject the blood yet. And consequently, if we look at the volume of blood in the ventricles, they're full, but it's not changing. No blood is leaving. Okay, so all of this is what's happening in isovolumetric contraction of the ventricles. I don't know why this is not moving. Here we go. Okay, so now we move into the phase known as ventricular ejection. So the ventricles here depolarized and contracted, and if you recall, this flat line here is where the ventricular myocytes are contracting and holding their contraction because of that plateau where calcium stays present in the muscle cells. So we're squeezing and holding here, and we can see that the pressure in the ventricles remains higher than the pressure in the great arteries, and the whole time that it's higher, that means that we're able to eject blood. So we see the volume of blood going down in the ventricles, right? No heart sounds because the valve's open, blood is flowing. Now, if we look, we've got the indication of what's about to happen. At the very end of ventricular ejection, we see the T wave, which means that the ventricles are starting to repolarize and relax. And here we go. The T wave is finishing, so now the ventricles are starting to relax. The pressure is dropping. At the moment that the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower than the pressure in the great arteries, the blood in the great arteries is like, whoa, the ventricle looks a lot more chill. Let me go back to the ventricle. But the semilunar valve closes. And sure enough, if we go down here, we can see the second heart sound, indicating that the semilunar valve is closed. Now, the pressure in the ventricles continues to drop, but it's still not low enough to allow the AV valves to open. And so, even though the pressure is dropping, all the valves are closed and the volume of blood is not changing. As soon as the ventricular pressure becomes lower than the pressure in the atria, we are back at ventricular filling. Right? So the AV valve opens here, and the pressure in the ventricle is lower, and we're back to rapid filling. Okay, so that more or less is the cardiac cycle. It is putting together the electrical events, the depolarization and repolarization, the changes in pressure between the various locations, the arteries, the ventricles, and the atria, the volume of blood coming into and then out of the ventricles, and then the valves closing and opening, which we can't hear. Okay, so you can take a look at this graph on your own, and I suggest doing like I just did, and looking at one phase at a time and asking yourself, what information do I get from each of these graphs about what's going on in the phase? Okay. Every cycle, Yeah, every cardiac cycle follows the same basic sequence of events. And so this may help you to be able to put them together. We always see an electrical event, depolarization in this case, which leads to an increase in calcium, and that causes contraction, right? So electrical to contractile, the muscles contracting. And then with contraction, we start to see pressure increase. So these are the pressure increases. The increase in pressure first causes a valve to close, in this case, the AV valves, and then this prevents flow. Pressure continues to increase until another valve opens, and this allows flow. If we look at the other side of this, where we've got, I always forget I do this. So electrical, contractile, pressure, valve, valve, and flow. Okay. So if we look at the other side of this, which is repolarization and relaxation, we have repolarization, decreasing calcium, causing the ventricles to relax. Pressure decreases, valve closes, no flow. Pressure continues to decrease, valve opens, flow. So electrical, contractile, pressure, valve close, valve open, flow. So whatever helps you to put these things in the correct sequence so that you can see cause and effect. You can look at any of these different graphs or look at images, but this is what you're looking for. This causes this, which causes this, which causes this, which causes this, which causes this. So having them in sequence is super important. Alrighty, that was the cardiac cycle.